The video started making rounds on Tuesday morning. By lunchtime, it had already crossed 3 million views. A 7-year-old girl was sitting at a grand piano in what looked like an ordinary living room. Her tiny fingers moved across the black and white keys with incredible speed and precision. She was playing one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written, something that even professional pianists struggle with. The comment section exploded. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. "This is unbelievable," one person wrote. "She must have been born with this gift," said another. "God gives special talents to special people," someone commented. Thousands of people were sharing the video, tagging their friends, calling it a miracle. The girl's parents stood in the background of the video, their faces glowing with pride. Everything about the scene looked perfect. Too perfect, actually. Across town, a woman who studied child development for a living came across this video in her research. She had spent the last 15 years of her career looking into cases just like this one. Children who seemed to have magical abilities. Kids who could play instruments like professionals before they even learned to ride a bike. The world called them prodigies. But this researcher had learned to look beyond the surface. She had learned to ask questions that most people didn't want to ask. She watched the video 3 times. Each time she noticed things that the millions of excited viewers had missed. The way the lighting was set up wasn't accidental. The choice of that particular difficult piece wasn't random. The parents' expressions looked rehearsed, like they had practiced standing that way. Even the camera angle seemed carefully planned. This wasn't just a spontaneous moment of a child playing piano. This was a performance, and not just by the girl. The researcher had seen this exact pattern before. Not once or twice, but dozens of times. Different families, different instruments, different cities. But the story was always remarkably similar. A young child displays incredible skill. Everyone calls it natural talent. The media goes crazy, and nobody asks the obvious questions. Within 2 days, the video had 20 million views. The girl's parents were being contacted by talent agents from Los Angeles and New York. Morning television shows were fighting to book them for interviews. Documentary filmmakers were offering contracts. A major music company wanted to sign the 7-year-old to a recording deal. The machine was already in motion, and it moved fast. The story being told was simple and magical. The girl had walked up to the piano when she was just 4 years old. She sat down and started playing, as if she already knew how. Her parents claimed they were shocked. They said she had never taken a lesson. It was like the music was already inside her, just waiting to come out. This was the story everyone wanted to hear. This was the story that made the video go viral. This was the story that would sell concert tickets and piano lessons and inspire millions of parents to wonder if their own child might be hiding a secret genius. But the researcher knew better. She had interviewed too many families. She had studied too many cases. She had heard too many stories that fell apart when you looked closely. The truth was never as simple as natural talent or born genius. The truth was usually much more complicated, much more human, and much less magical. She decided to start digging. Not to hurt anyone or expose anyone, but because someone needed to tell the real story. Someone needed to ask what was happening behind those viral videos. Someone needed to think about these children as actual kids, not just as entertainment or inspiration for social media posts. The researcher started reaching out to people she had interviewed before. Adults who had once been called child prodigies themselves. People who had lived through the experience and could talk about what it was really like. She wanted to understand the full picture before these patterns repeated themselves with another generation of children. The first person she contacted was a young man in his early 20s. He had been famous when he was 8 years old for playing violin at a professional level. His face had been on magazine covers. He had performed at concert halls. His videos had millions of views, long before viral videos were even common. Now he was just trying to live a normal life, and he agreed to talk. They met at a quiet coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon. He looked tired, older than his 23 years. When she asked him about his childhood, he didn't start with the performances or the applause. He started with something else entirely. "People think it just happened," he told her, staring into his coffee cup. "Like one day I picked up a violin and could suddenly play like a professional." That's what everyone wanted to believe. That's what made the story exciting, but that's not what happened at all. He explained that his parents had put a violin in his hands when he was 3 years old, not because he asked for it, not because he showed some magical interest, but because they wanted him to learn. They had hired expensive teachers before he could even tie his own shoes. He practiced for hours every single day. 4 hours was normal, sometimes more on weekends. I remember crying, he said quietly. I remember wanting to go outside and play with the neighbor kids. But there was always another practice session, another lesson, another piece to master. My parents weren't mean about it. They really believed they were helping me. They thought they were giving me a gift. But I was 3 years old. I didn't choose any of it. The researcher listened carefully, taking notes. This matched what she had found in other cases. The pattern was consistent. Behind almost every child prodigy was a similar story. Parents who started training early, very early, earlier than most people would think possible. They hired the best teachers they could afford. They created strict practice schedules. They gave up family vacations, playdates, and normal childhood activities. Everything was structured around developing this one skill, and it worked. Of course it worked. A child's brain is incredibly adaptable. Start them young enough, practice enough hours, and they will develop skills that look superhuman to everyone else. But it wasn't superhuman. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a gift from above. It was just intensive training, started before most children learn their alphabet. The young man in the coffee shop had more to say. He talked about how isolated he felt as a child. While other kids his age were learning to make friends and play games, he was learning to perform for audiences. He never went to birthday parties. He never joined a sports team. His entire childhood revolved around one thing: getting better at violin. The worst part, he said, is that everyone praised my parents. People acted like they were so lucky to have a talented child. But they created the talent. They built it hour by hour, year by year. And now I'm an adult and I don't even know who I am without this instrument. The researcher thanked him for his time and honesty. As she walked back to her office, she thought about that 7-year-old girl in the viral video. She thought about the millions of people who believed they were watching natural talent. She thought about the parents who might see that video and decide to push their own children harder, hoping to discover hidden genius. Someone needed to tell the truth. Someone needed to pull back the curtain and show what really created these so-called prodigies, not to take away from their skill or hard work, but to ask harder questions about childhood, choice, and what we're really celebrating when we watch these videos. The truth was out there. It just wasn't the truth that most people wanted to hear. The researcher spent the next few weeks tracking down more former child prodigies. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. A woman who had been a chess champion at age 9 told her about the 8-hour study sessions that started when she was 5. A man who played cello on national television at age 7 described how his parents had soundproofed their basement so he could practice late into the night without disturbing neighbors. Every story had the same elements: early start, intensive training, parents who believed they were simply nurturing a natural gift, and a public that wanted to believe in magic rather than hard work. But there was something else too. Something the researcher hadn't fully considered until she started digging deeper into the business side of things. She discovered that the prodigy industry was worth millions of dollars. Music schools used these children in their advertising, promising parents that their school could unlock hidden genius in any child. Instrument manufacturers gave free pianos and violins to prodigy families in exchange for endorsements. Online platforms made money from the viral videos. Talent agencies built entire careers around discovering the next big child star. Everyone was making money except the children themselves. The researcher decided to look into the business structure more carefully. She found companies that specialized in marketing child prodigies. These companies would find talented young musicians, help their families create viral content, and then take a percentage of everything that came after. Concert bookings, recording contracts, sponsorship deals. It was a well-oiled machine. And it ran on one simple idea: the belief that some children are just born special. One afternoon, she received an anonymous email. Someone who worked at a prestigious music academy wanted to talk, but only if their identity stayed hidden. They met in a park, far from any cameras or recording devices. The person was a teacher who had worked with dozens of highly skilled young musicians over the past decade. "I need you to understand something," the teacher said, looking around nervously. "These kids are incredible. Their skill is real. But it's not what people think it is. Parents bring me 3-year-olds and ask me to make them prodigies. And I can. not because the children are special, but because their brains are still developing. If you start them young enough and practice them hard enough, you can create what looks like genius. The teacher explained the methods, breaking down complex pieces into tiny segments, practicing each segment hundreds of times, building muscle memory before the child even understands what music theory means, creating practice schedules that would exhaust most adults. It worked because young children's brains are like sponges. They absorb patterns and movements without questioning them. But there was a cost. I've seen kids burn out by age 12, the teacher continued. I've seen teenagers who resent their parents for stealing their childhood. I've seen young adults who are technically brilliant but have no idea how to function in normal social situations. And I've been part of the system that created them. That's why I wanted to talk to you. The teacher pulled out a folder filled with practice schedules from various students. The researcher looked through them, stunned. One 7-year-old practiced 25 hours per week. Another 8-year-old had a schedule that included practice sessions before school, after school, and on weekends. There was barely any time left for homework, let alone play or friendship. Do the parents know how much their children are practicing? The researcher asked. They know, the teacher replied. But they don't see it as extreme. They see it as necessary. They compare their children to professional musicians who practice for hours every day. But they forget that professional musicians are adults who chose that life. These are children who don't know any different. The researcher began to understand the full scope of what was happening. It wasn't just about pushy parents or greedy businesses. It was about a society that had fallen in love with the idea of natural genius. People wanted to believe that talent was something you were born with, not something that required sacrifice. Because if talent was just hard work in disguise, then everyone had to confront uncomfortable questions about effort, privilege, and access. She decided to investigate the science behind it all. She contacted researchers who studied brain development and skill acquisition. What they told her confirmed what she had been discovering through interviews. The human brain, especially a young child's brain, is extraordinarily adaptable. Start training early enough and you can create seemingly impossible skills. One neuroscientist showed her brain scans of young musicians. The areas responsible for motor control and auditory processing were significantly more developed than in children who didn't play instruments. But this wasn't because they were born different. It was because intensive practice had literally rewired their brains. The scientists called it neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt based on experience. What people call talent is often just early neuroplasticity meeting structured practice, the scientist explained. These children aren't gifted in the way most people think. They're the result of thousands of hours of training during a critical developmental window. Start any child early enough with good instruction and consistent practice and you can create similar results. The researcher asked about the psychological effects. The scientist's expression darkened. Studies showed that many former child prodigies struggled in adulthood. Anxiety and depression were common. Some had physical injuries from practicing before their bodies were fully developed. Many had difficulty with relationships and identity. They had spent their entire childhood pursuing someone else's dream, and now they didn't know who they were without their instrument. Back at her office, the researcher compiled everything she had learned. The picture was clear and disturbing. The prodigy myth was harming children while making money for everyone else. Parents genuinely believed they were helping their kids, but they were often projecting their own unfulfilled dreams onto children too young to understand what they were giving up. She found one particularly heartbreaking case. A family had taken out a second mortgage on their home to pay for their daughter's piano training. They had moved to a different city to be near a renowned instructor. The mother had quit her job to manage the daughter's practice schedule and travel to competitions. The daughter's siblings rarely saw their parents because all family resources went to supporting the one talented child. And the daughter? She was technically brilliant. She won competitions. She had performed at Carnegie Hall at age 10. But in private conversations away from her parents, she admitted she had never wanted any of it. She just wanted to make her parents happy. She had learned early that their love and attention came when she played well. So she kept playing, kept practicing, kept performing, even though she dreamed of being a veterinarian instead. The researcher interviewed experts in child psychology. They explained how children naturally want to please their parents. When parents show excitement and pride about a particular skill, children will pursue that skill to maintain the positive attention. This isn't manipulation by the parents. Most parents genuinely don't realize they're doing it. But the effect is real. Children shape their entire identities around activities that make their parents happy. One psychologist shared a concept that stuck with the researcher. We're creating a generation of children who are world-class at one thing, but have no idea who they are beyond that thing. They miss out on the exploration and experimentation that's crucial for healthy development. They don't get to try different activities, fail at things, discover their own interests. Everything is decided for them before they can even form their own opinions. The researcher also discovered something that made her even more concerned. The bar kept getting higher. As more parents pushed their children to start younger and practice harder, the definition of prodigy had to become more extreme to stand out. 20 years ago, a 10-year-old playing advanced pieces was remarkable. Now it had to be a 6-year-old. In another decade, would parents be starting children at age 2? Where did it end? She found online forums where parents compared their children's progress like athletes comparing race times. My son mastered this piece at age 7. Well, my daughter did it at 6. The children had become trophies, proof of their parents' success. And nobody seemed to be asking what the children themselves wanted. The evidence was overwhelming. Prodigies weren't born. They were manufactured through intensive early training. The talent that seemed magical was actually the result of structured practice during critical developmental years, and the cost of creating these prodigies was often the children's own childhoods, mental health, and ability to choose their own paths. The researcher knew she had enough information to write her article, but she also knew it would be controversial. People didn't want their heroes to be ordinary. They didn't want to believe that excellence required such sacrifice. They certainly didn't want to question whether that sacrifice was worth it. Still, the truth needed to be told. These children deserved someone to speak up for them. Someone to ask if we were celebrating their achievements or exploiting their youth. Someone to question whether creating a prodigy was really the gift we pretended it was. The researcher spent 3 months writing her article. She checked every fact twice, interviewed more than 40 people, and made sure every claim could be backed up with solid evidence. She knew what was coming. People would attack her findings. Parents would feel defensive. The music industry would push back. But the truth was too important to keep quiet. She titled the article, "The Prodigy Myth: How We Create Musical Geniuses and Why We Refuse to See the Truth." It was published in a respected psychology journal on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, the internet had exploded. The article laid out everything she had discovered. The intensive training that started in toddlerhood. The thousands of hours of practice that happened before these children even started elementary school. The business interests that profited from maintaining the myth of natural talent. The psychological damage that often showed up years later. And most importantly, the scientific evidence that prodigies were made, not born. Parents of famous young musicians were furious. One mother posted a long response on social media, insisting that her son had taught himself piano and that nobody had forced him to practice. The researcher's article, she claimed, was trying to diminish her child's natural gift. Within hours, thousands of people had shared the mother's post, agreeing that some children were simply born special, but something else was happening too. The researcher's inbox filled with messages from former child prodigies, dozens of them, then hundreds. They were thanking her. Finally, someone was telling their side of the story. Finally, someone was asking the questions that needed to be asked. One message stood out. It was from a woman who had been a piano prodigy in the 1990s. She had performed on television shows and won international competitions before she turned 12. Now she was 35 and worked as an accountant. She hadn't touched a piano in 15 years. "I spent my entire childhood practicing," she wrote, "every single day for hours. I missed birthday parties, school field trips, and sleepovers. My parents told everyone I was gifted, that I loved playing. But I was just a kid who wanted to make her parents proud. By the time I was old enough to realize I had a choice, I was so burned out I never wanted to see a piano again. Your article made me cry because someone finally said what I've felt for 20 years. I wasn't a prodigy. I was a child who practiced more than most adults work." The debate spread beyond academic circles. News channels picked up the story. Talk shows invited the researcher to explain her findings. And then came the interview that would change everything. A major morning show wanted to have a balanced discussion. They invited the researcher and the parents of the 7-year-old girl from the viral piano video. The interview was scheduled for Friday morning. The researcher prepared carefully, knowing she needed to be respectful while still speaking truth. She wasn't there to attack these parents. She was there to shine light on a pattern that affected thousands of families. The parents arrived with their daughter. The little girl looked tiny in the big studio chairs, wearing a dress that seemed too formal for a 7-year-old. Her mother sat close to her, protective and tense. The father kept adjusting his tie, clearly nervous about being on national television. The host started with softball questions, asking the parents about their daughter's gift. The mother launched into the familiar story, how their daughter had walked up to the piano at age 4 and just started playing, how they had been shocked, how it was clearly a natural talent, something she was born with. The researcher waited for her turn. When the host finally asked for her perspective, she spoke carefully. "I want to be clear that your daughter is incredibly skilled. Nobody is questioning that. What I'm asking is how that skill developed, because in every case I've studied, what looks like natural talent is actually the result of intensive, structured practice that started very early." The mother bristled. "Nobody forced our daughter to practice. She loves piano. It's her passion." The researcher nodded gently. "I believe she practices a lot." "How many hours per week would you say she practices?" There was a pause. The mother looked at the father. The father looked at the floor. Finally, the mother said, "She practices every day, but it's not like we force her." "How many hours?" The researcher pressed, keeping her voice kind but firm. "Maybe 3 or 4 hours a day," the mother admitted. "But she wants to. She asked to practice." The researcher did the math out loud. "That's 21 to 28 hours per week. For a 7-year-old, that's more than many adults work at their full-time jobs. And she's been doing this since she was how old?" Another uncomfortable pause. "We started her on simple pieces when she was about 3, the father said quietly. The researcher turned to face the camera, speaking to the audience. "This is what I'm talking about. A child who has practiced 4 hours a day since age 3 has accumulated around 6,000 hours of practice. By age 7, that's not a gift. That's systematic training. The question we should be asking is whether it's healthy for a 7-year-old to practice that much." The mother's face reddened. "You're making it sound like we're bad parents. We're supporting our daughter's talent. That's what good parents do." "I'm not saying you're bad parents," the researcher said carefully. "I'm saying we need to have an honest conversation about what we're really celebrating when we call a child a prodigy. Are we celebrating their skill, or are we celebrating their parents' dedication to training them? And more importantly, are we thinking about what that child might be giving up?" Then the host did something unexpected. He turned to the little girl who had been sitting quietly the whole time. "Sweetheart, do you like playing piano?" The girl looked at her mother before answering. That moment, that split-second glance said everything. Finally, she nodded and said, "Yes." "Do you ever want to do other things?" the host asked. "Like play with friends or play sports?" Another glance at her mother. This time a longer pause. The girl's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide it. Before she could answer, her mother jumped in. "She has piano friends. She loves what she does. This is her passion." But the damage was done. Millions of viewers had seen that little girl look to her mother for permission before answering. They had seen the tears. They had seen a 7-year-old who couldn't speak freely about her own feelings. The researcher didn't need to say anything else. The truth had shown itself. After the show, the researcher received even more messages. But now they weren't just from former prodigies. Parents were writing too. Some were angry, defensive about their choices, but others were starting to question. One mother wrote, "I watched that interview and saw myself. I've been pushing my son to practice violin because I always wanted to play but never got the chance. Your article made me realize I'm living my dream through him, not supporting his dream." The scientific community rallied behind the researchers' findings. Other psychologists published supporting studies. A major research institution in Europe released data from a 20-year study that confirmed everything she had been saying. Children who were labeled prodigies had simply started intensive training earlier than their peers. There was no magic gene, no special gift, just early practice and focused instruction. Music teachers began speaking up too. Some admitted they had been uncomfortable with the young students they were teaching, but had stayed quiet because parents insisted on it. Others talked about students who had incredible technical skill but seemed joyless, going through the motions without any real connection to the music. The debate reached a tipping point when a famous concert pianist published an essay about his own childhood. He was now 50 years old and had performed around the world. Everyone assumed he had been a prodigy, but in his essay he revealed that he had actually started piano relatively late, at age 9. He had learned at a normal pace, practiced reasonable hours, and still became one of the best pianists in the world. His message was clear. You didn't need to sacrifice childhood to achieve excellence. Meanwhile, the video of the morning show interview kept circulating online. People couldn't stop talking about that moment when the little girl looked to her mother before answering. Comment sections filled with personal stories. Former child athletes, musicians, and academic competitors shared their experiences. A pattern emerged. So many people had been pushed into excellence by well-meaning parents who couldn't see the cost. The researcher watched all of this unfold with mixed feelings. She was glad the conversation was happening, but she also felt sad for all the families caught in this system. Most parents genuinely believed they were helping their children. They had been told that starting early and practicing intensively was how you supported talent. They had been sold a myth by an industry that profited from their dedication and their money. What bothered her most was how society celebrated these children. Every viral video, every news story about a young prodigy sent a message to parents. This could be your child if you just push hard enough. Nobody talked about the majority of children who burned out. Nobody followed up with former prodigies to see how they were doing at 25 or 35. The success stories got all the attention while the casualties suffered in silence. The researcher knew her work was far from over. One article, one interview wasn't enough to change an entire cultural belief system. But at least people were starting to ask questions. At least the conversation had begun. 3 months after the television interview, something unexpected happened. The researcher received an email that made her heart skip a beat. It was from the mother of the 7-year-old piano player. The same mother who had defended her parenting choices on national television. The same mother who had insisted her daughter's talent was a gift from birth. She wanted to meet in person. The researcher wasn't sure what to expect. Was this mother angry? Did she want to argue? Was she planning to threaten legal action? But something in the tone of the email felt different. It felt vulnerable, almost desperate, so the researcher agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet cafe on a Tuesday afternoon. The mother looked different than she had on television, tired, smaller somehow. Her hands shook slightly as she held her coffee cup. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the mother broke the silence. I need to tell you something, and it's not easy for me to say. Her eyes were already filling with tears. You were right. About everything. And I think I've known it for a long time, but I couldn't admit it to myself. The researcher stayed quiet, letting the mother continue at her own pace. I was a pianist, the mother said softly, not a great one. I started lessons when I was 12, which everyone told me was too late. I practiced for years, dreamed of performing, of making music my life. But I was never good enough. I could play well, but not like the people who started young. I watched other pianists perform and felt like I had missed my chance. She paused, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Then I had my daughter, and when she showed even the slightest interest in the piano, something in me saw a second chance. I told myself I was just supporting her natural interest, but looking back now I realize I was the one who pushed. I was the one who scheduled the lessons, created the practice routine, chose the pieces. I convinced myself she loved it because I needed to believe that. The researcher listened as the mother explained everything. How she had started her daughter on simple exercises at age 3, disguised as games. How she had gradually increased practice time, always framing it as fun. How she had hired expensive teachers and rearranged the entire family schedule around piano. How she had created that viral video, carefully planning the lighting and camera angle, hoping it would lead to opportunities. I told myself I was giving her the gift I never had. The mother continued, I thought starting her young meant she would have the career I always wanted. But your article made me realize something awful. I wasn't giving her a gift. I was giving her my unfulfilled dream. I was using her to live the life I never got to have. The mother pulled out her phone and showed the researcher something. It was a video, not posted publicly, just saved on her device. Her daughter was at a friend's birthday party, one of the first social events she had attended in years. The little girl was laughing, playing games with other children, eating cake with frosting on her face. She looked like a normal 7-year-old, and she looked happy in a way she never did at the piano. That's when I really saw it, the mother said. She was more genuinely joyful in that 2-hour party than I've seen her in years of performing. And I realized I've been so focused on building this prodigy image that I forgot to let her just be a kid. The mother had started seeing a therapist after the television interview. The therapist helped her understand how she had been projecting her own desires onto her daughter. She had been so invested in the prodigy identity that she couldn't see how much pressure she was putting on a small child. Every time her daughter looked to her for approval, she had interpreted it as love for piano. But really, the child was just trying to please her mother, trying to earn love and attention through performance. I've started making changes, the mother explained. We've cut her practice time in half. She's joined a soccer team. She has playdates now. And you know what? She still plays piano, but less. And I'm trying to learn to be okay with that. The researcher felt a wave of emotion. This was exactly what she had hoped her work might accomplish. Not to shame parents or attack families, but to open eyes and start conversations that could help children. How is your daughter doing with the changes? She asked. She seems lighter, the mother said with a sad smile. She laughs more. She talks about things other than piano. Last week she asked if she could take swimming lessons, and I said yes. The old me would have said no because it would take time away from practice. But I'm trying to let her explore who she is beyond music. The mother also shared something harder to admit. The response from their community had been mixed. Some family friends had been supportive, saying they always worried about how much the child was practicing, but others accused the mother of wasting her daughter's talent, of giving up on greatness. Other parents of musical children had distanced themselves, as if the mother's change of heart was somehow a judgment on their choices. The hardest part is dealing with my own disappointment, the mother confessed. I have to grieve the dream I had built in my mind. The dream of my daughter performing at Carnegie Hall, becoming famous, proving that starting young and working hard pays off. I realize now that was my dream, not hers. But letting go of it hurts. The researcher understood. This was the hidden cost that nobody talked about. Parents who built their entire identities around their children's achievements had to face their own disappointments when they stepped back. It wasn't just about changing a practice schedule. It was about fundamentally rethinking what success meant and whose dreams they were chasing. The conversation shifted to broader patterns. The mother talked about the online groups she had been part of, where parents compared their children's progress obsessively. She described the pressure to post videos of performances, to showcase achievements, to prove their children were special. She admitted that much of her daughter's intensive training was driven by this need to compete, to show other parents that their child was the most talented. We weren't just training our kids, she said. We were turning them into trophies. Evidence that we were good parents, that we made the right choices, that our families were successful, and we did it while telling ourselves it was all for them. The researcher shared some of what she had learned from other families who had made similar changes. It wasn't easy. Children who had built their identities around being prodigies often struggled when that identity was loosened. They had to learn who they were beyond their instrument. Some felt lost. Others felt relieved. Many felt both at the same time. But there were success stories too. Teenagers who had been allowed to step back from intensive music training and discovered other interests. Young adults who returned to their instruments later, playing for joy rather than obligation. People who found balance and developed more complete identities beyond a single skill. The mother asked a question that revealed how much she was still processing. Do you think I damaged her? Is it too late to fix what I've done? The researcher chose her words carefully. Children are resilient. You're making changes while she's still young. That matters. The fact that you recognize the problem and are willing to change shows real courage. Many parents never get there. They keep pushing until their children break and then they wonder what went wrong. She continued, what's important now is letting your daughter discover who she is. Not who you want her to be. Not who the internet thinks she should be, but who she actually is. That means she might continue with piano or she might not. She might be good at other things or she might just be average at everything. And all of that has to be okay. The mother nodded, tears flowing freely now. I just want her to be happy. I can't believe it took me this long to realize that should have been the goal all along. Before they parted, the mother mentioned something that gave the researcher hope. She had been contacted by other parents from the Prodigy community, parents who had watched the television interview and started questioning their own choices. Some were reaching out privately, asking for advice on how to make changes without completely disrupting their children's lives. A quiet revolution was happening, one family at a time. The researcher left that meeting feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that things could change. Not for everyone, not overnight, but gradually. One parent at a time, one child at a time, people were starting to ask the right questions. She thought about all the children out there, practicing instruments for hours every day, performing for cameras, living lives chosen by adults. She couldn't save them all. But maybe her work had planted seeds that would grow into something bigger. Maybe other parents would see themselves in this mother's story and have the courage to make changes too. The research continued. More studies were published supporting her findings. More former prodigies came forward with their stories. More teachers spoke up about their concerns. The conversation was spreading beyond academic journals and television interviews. It was reaching parents in their homes, in their social media feeds, in their music schools. The industry was starting to shift too. Some music academies began revising their policies for young students, limiting practice hours and requiring time for other activities. A few competition organizations created new age-appropriate categories that emphasized musical development over technical perfection. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was movement in the right direction. Still, resistance remained strong. The myth of the natural prodigy was deeply embedded in culture. People wanted to believe in special children with magical gifts. They wanted to believe that excellence could come without sacrifice. They wanted simple stories about talent and destiny, not complicated truths about intensive training and childhood lost. But at least now there was a counter-narrative. At least now parents had permission to question. At least now children had advocates asking whether the cost of prodigy status was worth paying. The truth was out there, competing with the myth. And slowly, gradually, the truth was gaining ground. A year had passed since the researcher published her article. The world hadn't completely changed, but something had shifted. The conversation about child prodigies was different now. People were asking questions they hadn't asked before. Parents were making choices they wouldn't have made a year ago. And slowly, quietly, lives were changing. The researcher received an invitation to speak at a national conference on child development. When she arrived, she was surprised by how many people attended her session. The room was packed with parents, teachers, psychologists, and even some former prodigies themselves. Everyone wanted to understand what happened after the truth came out. She shared updates on the families she had followed. The young man who had played violin as a child prodigy was now in graduate school, studying psychology. He wanted to help other former prodigies process their experiences. The woman who had quit piano at age 12 had recently bought a keyboard. Not to perform or compete, but just to play for herself sometimes, on her own terms. But the most interesting update was about the 7-year-old girl from the viral video. Her mother had given the researcher permission to share their story, hoping it might help other families. The little girl was now 8 years old. She still played piano, but only for about an hour a day. She had joined a soccer team and discovered she loved it. She had made friends at school. She had recently asked to try art classes. The most remarkable thing, the researcher told the audience, is that she seems happier. Her mother says she laughs more, plays more, acts more like a typical 8-year-old. And yes, her piano skills haven't progressed as rapidly as they would have with intensive training, but she's developing as a whole person, not just as a musician. The audience was silent, absorbing this. Then someone in the back raised their hand. It was a father holding hands with a young boy who looked about 9 years old. "My son is a competitive chess player," the father said, his voice shaking slightly. "He practices 4 hours a day. Everyone calls him a prodigy. But after hearing your research, I've been questioning everything. How do I know if I'm supporting his passion or pushing my own agenda?" The researcher appreciated his honesty. The best way to know is to step back and watch what happens. Give him space to choose other activities. See what he gravitates toward when you're not directing him. And most importantly, make sure he knows your love isn't conditional on his chess performance, that your pride in him doesn't depend on winning. The father nodded slowly, clearly wrestling with difficult emotions. His son looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. Hope, maybe, or relief. More hands went up. A music teacher wanted to know how to balance developing talent with protecting childhood. A grandmother was worried about her granddaughter's gymnastics schedule. A college student who had been a child prodigy wanted advice on dealing with resentment toward her parents. Each question revealed how widespread this issue was. How many families were caught in the same trap? The researcher answered as honestly as she could, but she also acknowledged what she didn't know. There were no easy answers. Every family was different. Every child was unique. The goal wasn't to eliminate all structured learning or discourage excellence. The goal was to make sure children had choices, voices, and childhoods that belonged to them. After the conference, the researcher was approached by representatives from several major music organizations. They wanted to work with her to develop new guidelines for teaching young students, age-appropriate practice recommendations, requirements for free play and social time, better screening for parents who were living vicariously through their children. It wasn't everything, but it was progress. The most meaningful conversation happened in the parking lot as she was leaving. A teenage girl, maybe 16 years old, stopped her. "I wanted to say thank you," the girl said quietly. "I've been playing violin since I was 4. I'm good at it. Really good. But I've never been sure if I actually like it, or if I just learned to like it because everyone expected me to. Your research gave me permission to ask that question out loud." The researcher asked what the girl had decided. The teenager smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I'm taking a gap year after high school. No performances, no competitions. Just time to figure out who I am without the violin. My parents weren't happy at first, but they're coming around. And honestly, I feel lighter than I've felt in years. Maybe I'll come back to violin. Maybe I won't. But at least it'll be my choice." That conversation stayed with the researcher for days. That was the point of everything she had done. Not to stop children from developing skills or pursuing excellence, but to make sure those pursuits were their own choices, not scripts written by adults with unfulfilled dreams. The cultural shift was happening in other ways too. Fewer viral videos of young prodigies were getting the same unquestioning celebration. Comment sections now included people asking about practice hours and wondering about the child's well-being. Some parents were choosing not to post videos of their talented children at all, wanting to protect their privacy and avoid the pressure that came with public attention. Several former child prodigies had formed a support group. They met monthly, sharing their experiences and helping each other process complicated feelings about their childhoods. Some were grateful for the skills they had learned, even if the cost had been high. Others were working through trauma and resentment. Most felt a mixture of both. The group provided space for all of it without judgment. The researcher attended one of their meetings as an observer. She listened as a 25-year-old former pianist talked about learning to play again after years away from music. "I had to separate the piano from all the baggage," the young woman explained. "The pressure, the expectations, the identity. Now when I play, it's just for me, and that feels like freedom." Another member, a man in his 30s who had been a chess prodigy, shared his journey toward forgiving his parents. "They genuinely thought they were helping me," he said. "They saw I had ability and wanted to maximize it. They didn't understand what they were taking away. I'm trying to accept that they did their best with what they knew, even though their best wasn't good enough." The conversation touched on something the researcher had been thinking about a lot. Blame wasn't productive. Most parents of prodigies weren't villains. They were people who had bought into a myth that society sold them. They were told that starting early and pushing hard was how you helped talented children reach their potential. They were praised for their dedication and envied for having gifted kids. The system reinforced their choices at every turn. Breaking that system required more than shaming individual parents. It required changing the cultural narratives about talent and success. It required the business interests that profited from child prodigies to prioritize well-being over profit. It required all of society to value childhood for its own sake, not just as preparation for adult achievement. Some of those changes were starting to happen. Educational organizations were developing new frameworks that balanced skill development with age-appropriate development. Mental health professionals were creating resources specifically for former prodigies. Researchers were conducting long-term studies to better understand the lasting impacts of intensive early training. But perhaps the most important change was happening in individual homes. Parents who were willing to question their assumptions, families who were brave enough to make different choices, even when those choices meant their children wouldn't be famous or exceptional. adults who valued their children's happiness more than their achievements. The researcher thought about the 7-year-old girl, now 8, playing soccer and taking art classes alongside her reduced piano practice. That child would never know what it was like to be a celebrated prodigy. She wouldn't have millions of views on her videos or perform at prestigious venues as a child. But maybe, just maybe, she would grow up knowing who she was beyond a single skill. She would have memories of playing with friends, trying new things, being allowed to be average at some activities and good at others. That seemed like a worthy trade-off. A childhood filled with exploration and choice instead of perfection and pressure. A chance to discover her own interests instead of living out someone else's dreams. The opportunity to fail, learn, grow, and change without every stumble being seen as wasted potential. The researcher's phone buzzed. It was a message from the mother she had met at the cafe. She had sent a photo of her daughter covered in paint from art class, grinning widely with the caption, "She made this today and couldn't stop talking about it. Thank you for helping me see what really matters." The researcher smiled and saved the photo. This was why the work mattered. Not the publications or the speaking engagements or the professional recognition, but these small moments where children got to be children, where parents chose presence over perfection, where families healed from patterns they hadn't known were harming them. The myth of the natural prodigy still existed. There were still parents pushing their young children to practice for hours daily, still businesses profiting from the dream of discovering genius, still people who wanted to believe that excellence required no sacrifice. Change was slow, resistance was real, and the work was far from finished. But something fundamental had shifted. The truth was out there now, competing with the myth. Parents had permission to question. Children had advocates. And slowly, one family at a time, people were choosing differently. The researcher closed her laptop and looked out the window. Somewhere out there, a child was playing parents they wanted to try something new. These weren't the stories that went viral or made headlines, but they were the stories that the prodigies might not be real in the way people wanted to believe. But the children were real. Their potential was real. Their right to childhoods filled with choice and joy,